Hey, welcome to our roundtable today. And today it's just Cindy and me, but we have a really good conversation coming up on vulnerability. And
Ooh.
I know, it's gonna be good. Gonna get vulnerable. And let me just dive right in. It's gonna be a good combo. So, Cindy, I want to ask you, how do you define trust?
um, I think that it's something that's easily broken and something that's hard to earn. And I think it is slowly built up over time through small and big interactions, but the small ones also are important. It's like showing up for the other person in a way that they need to you to show up, and like that consistency. So I think of it like different forms, right? Like if it's in at work, sorry, if it's in like your friendship, it's about like not judging them, being there for them, being real when they need some tough love. But like most importantly, it's about being there when they're going through some shit. And like if it's work, it's like following through on what you say. And yeah, I think it's like really sticking to and honoring your side of the relationship.
Yeah, yeah. I feel like there's like a definite, it's almost like a practice. You have to follow through with what you're saying. And it is definitely earned up over time. And it's not something that you just get right away when you first talk to a stranger or something like that. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think like when I was younger, I definitely gave trust overly much. It's like you're naive and you can't imagine that this person wouldn't follow through. And then over time, you do learn that like this is what I'm comfortable with when I give my trust out, because I guess the segue is that when you trust, you leave yourself vulnerable to disappointment, to hurt.
Yeah, potentially.
Sorry, can you still hear that?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
What was I gonna say? Do you know who Brené Brown is? Yeah, she's amazing. She's really amazing. And since we're discussing vulnerability, she's definitely the one to talk about. And she defined trust as like her daughter had been in a fight, or not in a fight, but she had trusted her friend with some very like intimate information, and her friend told everybody at recess.
Oh no.
And she went home and she was like, I'm not going to trust anyone ever again, because apparently after her friend told everyone, her like everyone started laughing, and it got so bad that her teacher had to take marbles out of the marble jar. And the marble jar was when, if you do something good, you put a marble in. When they do something bad, the teacher would take the marbles out. And so anyway, um, long story short, her daughter was at home just crying at the door and saying, I'm never going to trust anyone again. And Brené Brown was saying, well, do you know what trust is? Trust is like your marble jar. And those those few friends, they have to earn your trust before you put the marble. They're like a marble, and before you put them in your marble jar. And your marble jar is the people who you trust. So that's kind of like a metaphor, so to speak, for what trust is, I guess, in Brené Brown's words.
Pretty sure I've read that same book.
Right.
And I'm a huge Brené Brown fan. And yeah, I think it's really powerful, the stuff that she's doing to help us all better understand vulnerability and
Mm,
making herself vulnerable as an example and being very real with the way that she struggles with it. I think it makes it a lot more approachable. Like when vulnerability doesn't come easily right away for me, I think about her and how she's like, yeah, this is against every one of my basic instincts.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And just taking the time to do it, to be courageous, right?
So freaking difficult.
Yeah, yeah. So that's gonna segue into my next question. When have you noticed you've been vulnerable as opposed to oversharing in like a victim with a victim mentality?
Hmm.
You don't have to
I
go
think,
into specifics.
yeah, I think it's a difficult line. Um, we have been an oversharer in the past.
Me
Um,
too.
I think it's fear driven, loneliness driven, like you're seeking that closeness. But I think through experience you learn that that kind of connection can't be faked. Like you can't speed it up any more than it
Yeah.
is meant to actually happen naturally over time.
There's a
And
little bit of like insecurity and self-worth to do with that too.
yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Hmm.
Yeah, and I think I've learned to be vulnerable, or I've had the courage to be vulnerable when a couple of instances. I think the first is when I see other people do it, then it becomes easier to do the same, knowing that there's someone who's put something out there. It's less scary to put yourself on the line as well.
Yeah.
And I think that brings up a really good point about the insecurity and low self-worth, because I think it's more doable, not easy, but more doable to be vulnerable when I feel a strong sense of self, when I think that what I have to say, my experience is worthwhile, and that I feel safe and secure in myself, not really like, not quite as self conscious, not quite filled with as much self doubt, and not overly worrying about what other people will think. Of course,
Yeah,
very hard place to get to, but
it is. That's why it's called vulnerability.
yeah, and like I guess part of it is like the putting yourself out there and actually having that risk of being hurt of from that exposure, because
Mhm.
oh, it makes me think of like falling in love after you've broken up, right? They say like, oh, are you never gonna put yourself out there? It's better to have loved and lost. And yeah, it freaking hurts.
Mhm.
But does that mean that you stop trying again, right?
Yeah, I have another question that kind of surrounds that, what you're talking about later on. But I wanna read something that I just read today, and it kind of speaks to what we're talking about.
So very serendipitous.
I know. And it said, this is the holistic psychologist, Dr. LaPera, and she says, seeking external validation is an endless cycle of searching for someone else to prove we are worthy and lovable. This cycle leads to resentment, enabling, and anxiety because we are seeking for someone to give what was never their responsibility to give, our sense of self. And I think with vulnerability, or with not necessarily with vulnerability, because you can be sharing the same information as you are with oversharing, but you're sharing it with someone you trust who has earned the trust. And that's where it changes. And then it's not necessary, but because that person is in a position of empathy and knowing you, then they're able to receive that information differently. Whereas if you are sharing it with a stranger or something like that, they're not in the position to receive it very well, and it puts you in a position of that victim mentality. They don't know how to respond, and it's um it's a lot to process if you don't know someone, and it can catch you off guard.
Yeah, it makes me think of the term dumping rather
Yes,
than
yeah,
sharing. And it also makes me think like it's the intention. Like, what is the purpose that I'm sharing this with this
yeah,
person? Like,
exactly,
one with vulnerability, it really is about connection and like letting yourself be seen and heard. And
100%.
and then with the oversharing, it's like attention seeking or trying to feel validated when you don't think that what you have to say is valid, maybe.
Yeah, no, I get it, totally. I think you're absolutely right. And with what you said before with about you can't rush connection, I think that's a lot of where, I don't know, almost the root of or oversharing. For some people, I guess you can't say it for every situation, but I think that's there for a lot of people.
Yeah, myself included on that
Me
list.
too, me too, and I used to be quite an oversharer for, like, for a long time, and I mean, it can be totally unconscious. You don't even know, like, where it's coming from inside, but you just do it. Or and then looking back, you're like, "Oh, I shouldn't have necessarily done that." And
I think it's a little bit enabled by the disconnection that I had with my own feelings and my own boundaries. Oh, wow, resurfacing old topics. uh, but like once I learned to like listen to the physical sensations in my body, um, I really had this one experience where someone made me feel deeply uncomfortable. And I no longer felt safe. Like it was okay up to a point, and then I felt really unsafe. And I never would have given that feeling quite the same um, acknowledgement or validation. Like I would have just kind of brushed it off. Oh, I'm being weird. Oh, I'm being paranoid. But um, I genuinely felt uncomfortable and I needed to take that cue. Like I think it was my body's way, my spirit's way of showing me that what I was trying to make this relationship do was beyond the level of trust and connection that it had.
Hmm, wow. Wow, that's really interesting. Yeah. So how did you kind of like, did you realize it in the moment, or did was it in retrospect?
Mm, I think I did try to get out of there sooner than I would have otherwise, but it did take me some processing and some like good time alone with my journal.
Yeah.
And then I
Journaling is
vented
perfect.
to a very close confidant, and that was helpful too.
Yeah, that's good. That's good that you had that. I think everyone needs that person that they can be vulnerable with, have that trusting, like, soundboard almost, or person who will receive it.
Yeah, and you were just saying about journaling.
Mhm. Yeah, journaling's amazing because you can write anything down there, you're not rejected, it's just you, and yeah.
Your confidence can never be broken. Your journal is not going to tell anyone.
No, exactly, exactly, and it's a good way to, like, work through things because you can, I don't know, you kind of think a different way almost. If it's just in your head, it's kind of like it can be overbearing almost, and but once you write it out, you can see things in a different way.
Yeah, like once it's all laid out there versus sometimes like I think a little bit visually, a little bit emotionally, and then there's some words thrown in there, and you're just like, that's a lot of sensory overload, you know?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Exactly. So what do you think holds us or keeps us back from connection?
Hmm. Something immediately jumps up. I've had this conversation recently with some new mothers,
Mm,
and it's about like how you see like how sweet and innocent and like unguarded children are. And it's not until they've been hurt that we become more guarded. So I think it's one of those um, consequences of the scars that we develop through our life. And like, you're never gonna 100% be able to prevent them because getting hurt and being wounded is just a natural result of takes because there you'll never have like absolute certainty in the world, or a lot of the time you won't.
I think it's
Lack
also, like, a lack of worth and a lack of courage too. But yeah, like what you're saying is, if you've been hurt too many times almost, that, um, you might be too guarded, you know?
What do
Yeah.
you mean a lack of worth though? How does that translate?
If you don't feel worthy or you feel you might withdraw
Mm.
and not feel good enough to step up and be like, "I'm good enough for this person."
Oh, yes, yes, very much so.
Yeah.
Um, I think with that low self-confidence, yeah, it makes um deepening the connection more scary.
Yeah, yeah, and it's very difficult to open up because you're so scared. So scared and so, like you don't feel you deserve it almost.
Very well said. Yeah, is it um you know with attachment styles, how there's like anxious and avoidant and
Mhm,
anxious avoidant,
mhm,
all of three which are not secure.
mm,
um it makes me think a little bit about avoidant and maybe anxious avoidant, where like as you feel this connection getting stronger, it scares you, and that's why you have this urge to avoid,
yeah,
because your past experience is that when you start to feel close, that's when, you know, the rug will be ripped out under you
right.
and you just preemptively withdraw.
Yeah, yeah, totally, totally. And that's how do you then fully embrace being vulnerable?
So I, again, back to Brené Brown.
Yeah,
One of the things that she does at the end of her podcast interviews is the lightning round of questions, right?
okay.
And one of the questions in there is, what do you do if you feel that fear in your body? Like you really feel that fear. What's the next thing that you do? And without fail, like almost every person says that they take a breath, they acknowledge the fear, and then they do it anyway.
Oh,
So I think it's really true. Like you don't want to dismiss the fear because it's survival, like it's there for a reason.
exactly.
And you don't have to let it be in the driver's seat. Like you can take a breath, go to that wise mind place, because I mean, if you're actually in a situation of danger and your rational mind thinks it's dangerous too, like get the hell out of there.
Yeah, and the thing is too, what you're talking about is courage, and, just noticing the problem, acknowledging that fear inside, and acknowledging the situation. That's courage right there. That's the start of it, and then kind of assessing the situation and responding, moving forward, doing
Yeah,
it
like consciously making a
exactly.
decision.
Yeah,
Because I think if we move from that subconscious, disconnected place, then the fear might prevent us from doing things that are actually good for us, or like where we might grow. But if we acknowledge that it's there and the situation is scary, we can decide, like, make the choice whether to proceed or to withdraw.
true,
Yeah.
true. Yeah. Yeah, because when you make a decision from fear, it's gonna go to a negative place. Yeah, it's important to see
And then
the
you
whole.
feel like, oh no, you go.
Oh, I was gonna say, it's important to see the whole picture and then sort
I
of
think,
weigh out both sides.
yeah. And I think that's where like it's very helpful to have that dialectic skill to be able to see the emotional side, the fear, and to be able to at the same time bring in your rational prefrontal cortex.
Right, right. And get out of, I think it's the amygdala where it's like fight or flight. Yeah, you wanna try and get out of that as unless it is, like, valid. You need
Yeah.
to get out of that. Yeah.
Yeah, the example I really like is if a speeding car is coming towards you, like you
Yeah.
don't want to slow down and think, like you just want to jump out of the way.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Keep it realistic, right? So my next question, I think this goes back to what you were talking about earlier, and it was why do we feel so unsafe or uncomfortable with being vulnerable? Why do you think so?
I think it goes back to humans as social bonding creatures. That's what my healthcare professionals tell me.
Oh,
That we're social bonding creatures. And when we were like nomadic tribes people, it was a matter of survival, right? Like being rejected from the pack meant that you wouldn't get access to the fire and you probably wouldn't have food, and your genetics probably would not be still around today if you were rejected. And so I think it's very natural that we still have that fear and that hurt when we're rejected. And I think it's exactly because we don't have control over how other people will receive what we have to say, that that uncertainty and that possibility of rejection, that is what makes it really scary.
so you think it's a fear of rejection?
I think so. Or
I'm
like of not being accepted, being ridiculed. I remember um one really interesting thing that I learned through about trauma education is that part of your trauma can be that you no longer feel safe in the world, not just physically, but emotionally. And I'm like, I had never even thought of the concept of emotional safety before, but it's to
mhm.
feel like you can share your ideas and opinions without having them invalidated, ridiculed, minimized. And without that emotional safety, if past experience has taught you that you don't have that emotional safety. I think it makes a lot of sense that you would be afraid. Like we learn from our past
And
experiences.
if
So
you
if I
got hurt,
touch the yeah, like if I touch the stove and I have to jump away, I'm not gonna touch it again, hopefully.
yeah, exactly, exactly. And I guess kids, if you look at kids and vulnerability, like you said before, just being a little bit naive, and it's a lot easier for them to be vulnerable, or to show that vulnerability. I feel like saying that you're vulnerable and vulnerability are two separate things. But
Yeah, it's true because being vulnerable, it gives this sense that you're not strong versus choosing vulnerability in the face of fear takes a lot of courage, right?
exactly, exactly. Like, vulnerable is kind of on the side with victim, and vulnerability is more courage, like you just said.
Yeah, it's true. Huh. Yeah, very like similar sounding words, but very, very different.
Very.
It reminds me of like knowing to ask for help. It's I feel like it's easy to think that needing help is a sign of weakness or incapability, but the courage to raise your hand and admit that you need that help, that takes courage.
Absolutely, absolutely. And one thing though, it's I feel like it's not always conscious, like a fear of rejection too, because I feel like you could just be scared to show your, like, very intimate details about yourself. And I think that almost connects to what your story is. Like, people kind of equate, I guess, their intimate details with who they are and
Mm,
what their story is. So if you're sharing that with another person, then yes, you want them to accept that, but it's also, you're revealing who you are. It's you're exposed, almost like naked, and it's not that you're hiding it necessarily, but it's just for that reason of exposure. I think it's very, I don't know, maybe it does go hand in hand with what you said, that there is a fear of rejection.
I mean, what you're saying about the exposure and nakedness, um, it actually makes me think of something an old partner said to me. Um, he told me that I'm extremely guarded, that sometimes he felt like he was talking to a wall.
Oh, wow.
I know. And this was when I was an oversharer. I mean, come on. But like over time, after becoming a bit more self-aware, I can see where he was coming from. Like I I think it's part of that becoming defensive and like really being afraid of what the other person's going to say. And because so much of my self worth was dependent on external factors, like
Mhm.
that made that exposure and any hurt from that exposure like a direct diminishing of my self worth
Right.
versus if I just inherently feel that and have that self-confidence, the wise inner knowing that I am enough, then that external validation, it wouldn't be chipping away at my sense of self, my self-worth.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. So why do you think that we struggle with vulnerability?
Definitely because it's freaking hard.
Um,
Yeah, it's like definitely a practiced thing. And I think it becomes a little bit easier when there's people like Brene Brown, like bringing it into the open dialogue, like making us aware that that it's something that everyone goes through, that it's deeply ingrained in us, and that there's this whole rare group of people, the ones who live wholeheartedly, who get there by being and embracing vulnerability and love.
Mhm. Mhm.
I remember, I don't know which of her books this is, but I remember in one of her books, she talks about love and how allowing yourself to feel love and joy and happiness is a very vulnerable place to be. I think she gives the example of like, she was looking at her daughter sleeping, and all of a sudden she's overcome by this fear that like something terrible is going to happen to her.
Right.
And it is hard, when you're happy, when you're enjoying something, like
It can switch.
that, yeah, that icky part of your brain is like, well, you better like hold on to this.
Yeah.
It probably won't last and it might be ripped away rudely from you. And now you're scared about losing it. And I think it's very vulnerable to be able to stay in that space of really loving and keeping yourself open to something while knowing that it's not going to last.
It's almost like your brain goes to the vulnerable side while switching from the authentic vulnerability. I don't, does that make sense?
Try
No.
again. Help me understand.
Okay. Because the moment with the baby was very authentic and was very actually was showing vulnerability where she's enjoying that moment, enjoying looking at her baby. But as soon as the fear came, the fear, I would say, is connected to being vulnerable. I guess it's still authentic, but it's not vulnerability. It's no longer vulnerability. It is being vulnerable.
Like suddenly there's an awareness of
Yeah.
how vulnerable this makes you.
Yeah.
I remember this thing that someone said once, and I'm like, oh, I totally do that. Um, I think she was talking about relationships and like the ways that she, handles them in her life. And she's like, yeah, every relationship that I've ever left, um, I am scared of it. And so I run away before they can hurt me. And of course, I leave everything in a blaze of fire behind me. I just got to set it all on fire before I go. And I'm
Right.
like, I feel that. I totally self sabotage out
Yeah.
of fear. I'm like, well, before you can decide you don't want me, my ass is out of here.
I've done that so many times. Yes, I can
uh,
relate. Yeah. Self-sabotage is the worst.
yeah, and I guess it really does come from that place of fear, because
And avoidance.
and avoidance. Yeah, you're just so afraid of like how much it will hurt if this thing happens. You torture yourself and you make it happen sooner. They're like, well, I'm not going to enjoy this anyway.
Yeah.
Just like, because knowing that this hurt may come down the line, you're like, nope, I need to be in control. I need to make it happen now while it's in my control, because things happening out of my control is too scary.
Mhm. Yeah. And I can actually see that in other people too. I can notice where they have gone in that road as well
Yeah.
in my life, but like seen it done to me, I guess, in that way. Yes.
Yeah, I think like as we get older, I think I've definitely become better at empathy, especially for my parents. They're like, you're not perfect,
Mhm.
but I can see, or maybe, and I can see um, why you might be this way. Like, what complicated, intricate parts of you are making you act in this way. And like, once you realize that your own actions may be fueled by fear,
Yeah.
you can start to see it in them, especially in their unconscious behaviors.
So I just want to ask you, how do you, it's kind of like a double-sided question, but how do you respond to someone who's oversharing, and how do you respond to someone like in that authentic like vulnerability, like with a confidant or with someone like that? How do you respond?
I think I'll answer the second part first.
Okay.
With someone who is genuinely being vulnerable and acting out of a place of courage, um, I'd like to acknowledge that they're being very vulnerable and that's hard. And then try as well to validate what they're saying, expressing how much I can see where they might be coming from, perhaps share some vulnerability of my own, but really um, feel seen and heard. Like give them those acknowledgments while they're talking and afterwards that they were heard.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. That's a really
Yeah,
good answer.
because I remember there was one time that my partner shared like a fear of his with me, and I didn't have an answer or solution right away, but I knew that was my only goal out of this conversation. Like that he understands that I have taken away how important this is to him and that it is really important to me because he's important to me.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
like it kind of just gives me the time to then figure out what my actual answer is. But like knowing or like trying to communicate that this matters to me.
Mhm. Mhm. Absolutely. Yeah.
For overshares, I don't know. You can it
Awesome.
depends how much you want this relationship, right?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Like if you're not so keen on preserving the longevity of the relationship, you very much could just be very forthright and not be very subtle or gentle at all. Um, but if you don't want to step on any toes, I think there's two ways out of it. One's a little bit more honest, and the other one's a little more of a white lie. So I I think you could just tell them like, "Hi, like I feel a little uncomfortable. Um, like I'm not sure I'm the right person for you to be telling this to. Like
Mhm.
I can try to help you figure out someone else, but like I'm not comfortable in this situation."
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I think that would be the best way to just to let them know you're making or they're making you feel uncomfortable.
Yeah, it's not about them, right? It's not about their thing. It's just like I'm not
Yeah.
in that space right now where I can be that for you.
Yeah, exactly. You're putting up a boundary.
The not so good way, if you're like, I just gotta get out of here, this gotta be efficient, like you can just, I gotta go, or can we talk about this later?
Yeah.
uh, yeah. Um, yeah, that sometimes rubs me the wrong way because it doesn't really get rid of the problem. It kind of just kicks the can down the road.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. It would happen at another point.
Yeah, but you never know. It's like sometimes if you ignore a problem and you kick it down the line, like maybe you will feel better about it down the line, or maybe they will find someone else to talk to while they're waiting for you.
Yeah, I think it's better to just be forthright, but be like strong.
Yeah, to use that I language, like this is how I feel.
Yes. Yes. and hopefully the person understands that.
Otherwise, it's a big fat sign that maybe
Maybe you two
they
can
need
be
to
again.
respect your boundary
Yeah,
more.
yeah. Would be crossing the boundary for sure. Yeah. Well, this was really nice, and yeah, I think it was a good discussion.
Yeah,
Um,
great questions, Joanna.
Thank you. Thank you. I really wanted to talk about vulnerability. It's such an interesting topic. I
Yeah,
Yeah, because we're all in there. Because we're humans, we're all have vulnerability and have our ways in which we do it too. Each way is different, I think, in how we share ourselves and share what's most important, very intimate things, because they are so important. They're like little treasures.
yeah, you can't just let anyone touch your treasures, see your treasures.
No, no, they have to earn it.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I'm glad to know you're also a fellow Brené Brown fan.
I am.
She's a super interesting woman.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly, for sure. Okay, well, thank you so much, Cindy, and we'll see you next time.
Oh, thanks. See you next time.